Next topic. Is it useful to treat hard and soft drugs differently?
Pete, would you then be willing to decriminalize, or at least entertain the decriminalization of marijuana, and to draw a distinction between soft drugs, so to speak, of which marijuana would be the primary example, and the harder drugs, heroin, cocaine, PCPs, methamphetamines? Would you be willing to entertain that?
I don't think it's a good idea to legalize either one, but of course I would make that distinction, because law enforcement makes the distinction, and indeed the law presently makes that distinction. But one of the popular mythologies is that there are people in prison for simple possession of marijuana. If you talk to judges, if you talk to prosecutors in particular, they will tell you that the people in the California prison system, at least, who are there because of drug convictions, were not there because of simple possession. They had copped a plea. They had engaged in plea bargaining. They are there because they are dealers.
Well, many of them are there as dealers, but again, take the case of dealers. Because of prohibition, the real dealers have found it advantageous to hire teenagers because the juvenile laws punish them less
severely.
Less severely.
Right.
When Nelson Rockefeller was governor of New York, he put in especially stringent laws on drugs. But the juveniles were exempted or on a lower level. And as a result, the drug dealers switched to using juveniles. The attempt to prohibit drugs is one of the main reasons for the destruction of the ghettos in our cities. I'm sure you agree with that, Pete, that if you go into the ghettos, the prohibition of drugs is one of the main reasons why the prisoners in prison are disproportionately black.
Well, I think this is a separate issue. I really do, because what you're saying is an indictment that is leveled by civil libertarians with respect to the criminal justice system in general.
Yes, it is.
And the answer is the criminal law ought to be enforced in a way that is totally colorblind. If it's not, it should be.
But it's not because the civil law is not colorblind. It's because the ghettos are a good place to distribute drugs for obvious reasons. That's where you have a group that will protect themselves, that will provide protection. The customers are not black, for the most part. They come in from the outside, shop in the inner cities.
So you have a relatively lawless environment where the serious dealers can set up shop, employ gangs and kids, and it becomes a distribution center for the white people from the suburbs.
Absolutely.
That's roughly. Could we engage?
A crucial question. Would legalization cause drug consumption to go up?
James Q. Wilson, quote, "The central problem with legalizing drugs is that it will increase drug consumption under almost any reasonable guess as to what the legalization regime would look like." Wilson then goes on to survey the literature. He finds that predictions about how much under a regime of legalization the price of hard drugs would drop range from a factor of 3 to a factor of 20. I quote again, "Now, take a powerfully addictive substance, one that not only operates on but modifies the brain, and ask how many more people would use it if its cash price were only 30% or even 5% of its current price. The answer must be a lot."
Well, we have a good deal of evidence to counter Jim Wilson. In the first place, remember that drugs of all kinds were perfectly legal in the United States before 1914 or 13, whatever. At that time,
the original Coca-Cola actually contained a trace of cocaine.
It contained cocaine.
Right.
You could buy it. And the level of drug addiction, by the best of estimates, was roughly the same as it is now. We have the experience now in Holland, where essentially marijuana is legalized or effectively legalized, and the rate of use of marijuana among teenagers, among youngsters in Holland, is less than it is in the United States. There are all sorts of things that Jim Wilson leaves out of that account. But for the moment, let me suppose that there were. I'm not saying there would not be more users. There might be.
But isn't that the
people
central
who
point?
would benefit most from legalization?
It is a central point.
The people who would benefit most from legalization are the addicts, because they would have an assurance of quality. They would not be in danger of their lives. They wouldn't have to become criminals in order to support the habit, it would be a wholly different world for them. Right now, you speak about crack babies. Right now, women who are pregnant women are afraid, who are drug users, are afraid to get prenatal care, afraid to get care because they'll be called criminals and turned over to the justice system.
Milton, let me go back to the other Wilson, James Q. Wilson. I quote Wilson, John Stuart Mill, the father of modern libertarians, I go now to the moral point, argued that society can only exert power over its members in order to prevent harm to others. I, James Q. Wilson, think the harm to others from drug legalization will be greater than the harm, and it is a great harm. It will be greater than the harm that now exists from keeping these drugs illegal. So it is a moral duty of the government to do what it can to contain the problem.
Well, I think it's a wholly specious argument because the argument for drug prohibition has always been in terms of the interests of the drug users themselves, to prevent people from becoming drug users.
Right.
And so far as John Stuart Mill's dictum is concerned, he says government may never interfere for the benefit of the people who are using it or are making the decision themselves, only for the harm done to third parties.
You may victimize yourself if you wish to, and the government, that is not the government's business.
That's not the government's business. That's your business. You belong to yourself.
He is concerned about the user. I am far more concerned about the user's parents, about the user's child, that addicted crack baby, about all the people who are indeed the victims of the use of dangerous drugs, whether it is legalized or whether it remains illegal. And Jim Wilson is right. That really is the issue. How do you restrict the number of people who will become users and thereby minimize the tragedy?
Pete, can I just...
What kind of arguments are Milton and Pete making? Moral or utilitarian?
It sounded to me a moment ago as though we were slip-sliding from John Stuart Mill in the direction of Jeremy Bentham and the greatest good for the greater number. Is it, to both of you, merely an economic question which ought, in principle, to be open to investigation?
No, neither of us is
that is
primarily
to say,
an economic
if
question.
we're simply trying to say under one regime we have more drug users and under the other regime we have fewer drug users, whichever regime produces the fewer drug users is what we'll go for. That is not the case.
Of course not, because you have to take account of the other harm which is done in the process of trying to prohibit the use of drugs. Look, alcohol kills a lot more people than drugs do.
But you're nevertheless making a utilitarian rather than a moral argument. Drug use is wrong, and it is the responsibility of the government to embody moral values. You have none of that. You're not interested in that
Yes,
argument.
I am.
You are.
I personally
Right.
am opposed to drug prohibition on moral grounds. I think it's unethical. I think it's immoral. However, lots of people don't agree with that. And therefore, as a person who is looking at the argument and trying to make the argument, I have gone and said, let's suppose I didn't have that view. What would my attitude be then? And I say, even then, as I look at the costs on the one hand and the benefits on the other, I say that the benefits from drug prohibition, even to those people who believe it's moral, are far less than the costs. That this is that drug prohibition has been a failure. We've had 30 years to try it. We've spent tens of hundreds of millions of people. We've sacrificed the lives of tens of thousands of people in this country and in other countries. And what have we achieved?
The
Nothing.
same could be said for 30 or 40 years. The same could be said of our approach toward the Soviet Union. We at least contained it. We had to live with it, but we at least contained it. And that in itself is a moral and indeed a practical victory, right?
It's not clear,
Absolutely.
It's not clear that we haven't contained it.
Well, now, wait a minute. Let me give you some
Okay,
statistics
Pete.
that prove that we did when we were making the effort to do so. From 85 to 92, the estimated use of cocaine fell from 5.8 million Americans to 1.3. Now, that's a significant figure. And I'm not going to drown you with other statistics because I think that one makes the point.
Let me make you drug czar for a year. How would you prosecute the war on drugs if you could reform it in any way you chose to do? What ways would you reform it?
I would do everything that could both reduce demand and reduce supply. Reduce availability. And the last thing in the world that will reduce availability and reduce supply is to make it legal.
Okay, federal money.
There is no question. I mean, I would ask Milton, what happened to the consumption of alcohol when there was a repeal of prohibition?
First of all, when there was a repeal of prohibition,
Did the use increase?
initially it did, but then it started going down again. It was a temporary increase. It's not at all clear that prohibition reduced the consumption of alcohol. And what is clear is that alcoholic prohibition destroyed civil rights. It's clear that it also led to adulteration, that it led to a higher level of deaths. If you look at a different question, if you look at deaths from the use of alcohol, they rose
During Prohibition.
But the paramount question is, if you are talking about a substance that produces tragic results,
That's alcohol.
it is also dangerous drugs, far more than alcohol.
Not at all.
Well,
alcohol,
we differ on that as well.
But look at the rate
And
of
I'm not
use.
here